Welcome to the True Crime Family channel. Today our story starts. On the night of January 27th, 2011, the lights in the Carter household flickered off one by one, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. In the silence that followed, no one could have imagined the tragedy that was about to unfold. The neighborhood had always been a peaceful place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were hard to keep. But as the winter wind howled outside, a dark secret was about to be exposed, a secret that would shatter the illusion of tranquility and leave a trail of blood in its wake. The story unfolds in Brooklyn, New York, in a neighborhood where the houses stand close together and the lawns are perfectly manicured. It's the kind of place where people wave as they pass each other, where every driveway has a shiny car, and every family seems perfect from the outside. Laura Morgan was the picture of perfection. At 38, she had it all: a beautiful home, a handsome husband, and two children who excelled in everything they did. She was the kind of woman other women envied, always put together, always smiling. Her husband, Richard Morgan, was a successful corporate lawyer who worked long hours, often traveling for work. Laura, left alone to manage the household, had grown accustomed to his absences. She filled her days with charity work, yoga classes, and coffee dates with the other neighborhood wives. But beneath the surface, Laura was lonely. The long hours spent alone in a house that was too big, too quiet, began to weigh on her. She missed the passion, the excitement that had once filled her life. Richard had become distant, more focused on his career than on their marriage. He provided everything she could ever want, except for the one thing she craved most: affection. It was during one of Richard's many business trips that Laura first noticed Emily Carter, the vibrant and outgoing daughter of their next-door neighbors. Emily had just returned home from college for the summer, and she brought with her an energy that Laura found intoxicating. Emily was everything Laura used to be: young, carefree, full of life. As they spent more time together, Laura began to feel something she hadn't felt in years: desire. Emily was 22, with her whole life ahead of her. She was studying art at a college upstate and had returned home for the summer to figure out her next steps. Emily had always been close to her parents, James and Anna Carter, who had lived next to the Morgans for as long as she could remember. The Morgans had always been kind to her, and she admired them, especially Laura, who seemed to have everything figured out. At first, Emily saw Laura as a mentor, someone she could confide in about her future, her dreams, and her worries. But as they spent more time together, Emily began to see Laura differently. There was something about the way Laura looked at her, a hunger in her eyes that both excited and scared Emily. And then, one evening, it happened. What started as an innocent friendship crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Richard Morgan had always been a man of ambition. He'd worked his way up the corporate ladder, providing a life of comfort and luxury for his family. But with success came sacrifice. His job demanded more and more of his time, and the long hours took a toll on his marriage. He noticed the changes in Laura, the way she seemed distant, lost in thought, the way she avoided his touch. But he convinced himself it was just a phase, something they would work through. He had no idea how far gone things already were. James and Anna Carter were proud of their daughter, Emily. She had always been the light of their lives, and they were thrilled to have her home for the summer. They trusted her completely and never questioned the time she spent with Laura. After all, Laura was their friend, someone they had known and respected for years. But as the weeks passed, Anna began to notice subtle changes in Emily. She seemed restless, distracted. Anna chalked it up to the pressures of college life, never suspecting the true nature of Emily's relationship with Laura. It was a bright spring day when Laura Morgan first saw Emily Carter again. The neighborhood had come alive with the warmth of the season, and everyone seemed to be outside, enjoying the sun. Laura was out for her usual afternoon walk when she noticed Emily. She was sitting on the steps of her parents' house, reading a book. Emily had grown up so much since Laura last saw her. She wasn't the young girl who used to ride her bike around the block anymore. She was a young woman now, confident, beautiful, with a smile that could light up the whole street. Laura waved as she passed by, and Emily looked up, her eyes meeting Laura's. They exchanged a few polite words, talking about how the winter had been and how good it was to see the sun again. But there was something more in their conversation, a connection that sparked between them. Emily invited Laura to join her, and they sat on the steps, talking for what felt like hours. They talked about Emily's time at college, her dreams, her fears, and Laura shared stories of her life, her family, and her struggles. There was an ease between them that surprised Laura. She hadn't felt this kind of connection in a long time. As the days passed, Laura and Emily found more and more reasons to spend time together. They would meet at the neighborhood park, take long walks, or sit in the backyard with a glass of wine. Each meeting brought them closer, and soon the innocent conversations turned into something deeper. There was a tension between them that neither could ignore. Laura felt alive when she was with Emily, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Emily, on the other hand, was drawn to Laura's maturity and confidence. Laura had everything Emily admired: grace, wisdom, and an air of mystery. One evening, after a particularly long walk, they found themselves back at Laura's house. The sun had set and the night air was cool. They sat on the porch, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. Emily turned to Laura, and before she could think, she leaned in and kissed her. Laura froze for a moment, her mind racing. But then she kissed Emily back, the thrill of the forbidden washing over her. From that night on, their meetings became secretive, filled with stolen moments and whispered words. They knew what they were doing was wrong, but that only made it more exciting. Laura was intoxicated by the thrill of it all, the secrecy, the danger, the passion she had missed for so long. Emily, too, was swept up in the intensity of their relationship, fascinated by the new world Laura had opened up to her. They kept their affair hidden, careful not to let anyone suspect what was happening. Laura would send her children off to school and wait for Richard to leave for work before meeting Emily. They met in places where no one would see them, sharing their stolen moments. Every glance, every touch, every kiss was a risk, but that only made it more thrilling. For Laura, these moments with Emily were like a drug. She couldn't get enough of the excitement, the feeling of being desired, of breaking free from the chains of her perfect life. And so, the affair continued, growing deeper with each passing day, leading them both down a path from which there would be no return. By the summer of 2010, things had started to change. Richard Morgan, who had always been so focused on his career, began to notice the subtle shifts in his wife's behavior. Laura wasn't the same woman he married. She was distant, distracted, and her once warm and inviting smile seemed forced. She spent more time away from the house, often giving vague excuses about errands or meeting friends. Richard tried to brush it off at first, blaming his own demanding job for the growing gap between them. But deep down, a nagging suspicion started to take root. One evening, after returning from a long business trip, Richard found Laura sitting alone in the dark living room. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant. When he asked her what was wrong, she shrugged it off, claiming she was just tired. But Richard knew better. He could feel the tension in the air, the unease that had settled between them. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Meanwhile, the affair between Laura and Emily continued in secret, but it was no longer the thrilling escape it once was. The excitement that had once fueled their passion was now replaced by a growing sense of dread. Emily, who had been so captivated by Laura, began to feel the weight of what they were doing. The guilt gnawed at her, especially when she looked at her parents, who trusted Laura completely. She knew what they were doing was wrong, and the thrill of the forbidden was quickly fading. The breaking point came on a sweltering July afternoon. Emily, unable to bear the guilt any longer, decided to end the affair. She had spent sleepless nights wrestling with her conscience, and she knew she had to put a stop to it. She arranged to meet Laura at their usual spot, a secluded corner of the neighborhood park, far from prying eyes. When Emily arrived, it was clear she was anxious. Her hands were trembling, and she struggled to find the right words. Laura immediately sensed something was wrong. Emily avoided eye contact, and her usual warmth was replaced by a cold determination. After a tense silence, Emily finally conveyed that she could no longer continue their relationship. She expressed that it had to end, citing the wrongness of their actions. Laura, gripped by a rising panic, reacted with desperation. The fear of losing Emily, something she had dreaded, began to overwhelm her. She reached out, grabbing Emily's hand with a tight, pleading grip, indicating her unwillingness to let go. Laura's fear of returning to the emptiness and loneliness she had experienced before Emily came into her life was palpable. Despite Laura's desperation, Emily remained resolute, understanding that ending the affair was the right decision, even though it caused her inner turmoil. She attempted to pull away, emphasizing that their relationship was damaging them both. However, Laura refused to release her grip, driven by a need to hold on to what they had. In a final attempt to prevent Emily from leaving, Laura resorted to a threatening stance. She warned that if Emily walked away, she would reveal their relationship to everyone: Emily's parents, Laura's husband Richard, and others. This would leave Emily with nothing, a harsh ultimatum that underscored Laura's desperation to avoid losing the person who had become central to her. Emily froze, the threat hanging heavy in the air between them. She knew Laura wasn't bluffing. The fear of losing everything she held dear, the fear of the truth coming out, made her pause. She could see the desperation in Laura's eyes, the fear of being abandoned, and it shook her to her core. Emily realized she was trapped. Laura's words echoed in her mind, and she felt the walls closing in on her. Reluctantly, Emily agreed to continue the affair, but the power dynamic between them had shifted. What had once been a relationship built on mutual desire had now turned into a power struggle, with Laura holding the upper hand. The love and passion that once burned so brightly between them were now tainted by fear, guilt, and control. This marked the beginning of the end, as the affair spiraled further into darkness, pulling them both toward a tragic fate. By the beginning of 2011, Emily Carter had reached a breaking point. The affair with Laura, once a thrilling escape, had become a source of constant stress and fear. Emily knew she had to end it for her own sanity and future. She had started seeing someone new, a young man from her college who made her feel alive in a way that Laura no longer could. With him, she felt safe, normal, free from the burden of secrecy that had weighed her down for so long. As Emily grew closer to this new relationship, she pulled further away from Laura. She stopped answering Laura's calls and texts as frequently, and avoided meeting her altogether. Emily's decision was final. She needed to move on with her life, away from the toxic grip Laura had on her. But as Emily distanced herself, Laura's obsession grew. Laura sensed the change in Emily immediately. The signs were clear. Emily's coldness, her sudden unavailability, the way she spoke less and less about their future together. Laura's mind spiraled into paranoia. She felt Emily slipping through her fingers, and the thought of losing her was unbearable. Emily had been Laura's escape, her thrill, her secret. Without her, Laura feared she would fall back into the dull, lifeless existence she had before. The more Emily pulled away, the more desperate Laura became. She started showing up unannounced at Emily's house, trying to catch a glimpse of her, to feel that connection again. When that didn't work, she would drive by Emily's college, hoping to see her with that new man, to find proof of her betrayal. Laura's thoughts became consumed with Emily, and the fear of losing control over her drove her to the brink of madness. On that cold afternoon of January 22nd, the tension between Laura and Emily reached its peak. Emily's parents, James and Anna Carter, had gone out for the day, leaving Emily alone at home. Laura knew this and saw it as her last chance to confront Emily. She could no longer stand the thought of Emily moving on without her, of being replaced by someone else. Laura drove to the Carters' house, her mind racing with what she would say, how she would convince Emily to stay with her. When Laura arrived, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Emily was taken aback by Laura's sudden appearance, and the conversation quickly escalated. Laura, desperate and on edge, demanded answers, trying to understand why Emily was leaving her. Emily, firm in her decision, tried to end things once and for all, making it clear that their affair was over. But Laura couldn't accept it. Her desperation turned into anger, and her anger into rage. The confrontation spiraled out of control. Laura, feeling the full weight of her emotions, couldn't hold back any longer. In a moment of uncontrollable fury, she lunged at Emily. The struggle was brief, but intense. Laura, in a blind rage, wrapped her hands around Emily's neck, squeezing with all the strength she had. Emily tried to fight back, but Laura's grip was too strong, too determined. Within moments, Emily's body went limp, and the life drained from her eyes. As the reality of what she had done began to sink in, Laura was overcome with shock. She stood there, trembling, staring at Emily's lifeless body, unable to comprehend the horror of her actions. Panic set in quickly. Laura knew she had to cover her tracks, to make it look like anything other than what it really was, a cold-blooded murder. She hastily wiped away any trace of her presence, ransacking the house to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. She took a few valuables and fled the scene, leaving Emily's body behind, hoping it would be enough to throw off the authorities. The next day, the quiet neighborhood was shattered by the sound of Anna Carter's screams. She had returned home to find her daughter's body, cold and lifeless, lying on the living room floor. The scene was chaotic. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied, and broken glass scattered across the room. But none of that registered with Anna. All she could see was Emily, her precious daughter, lying there, unmoving. Anna immediately called the police, her voice shaking with hysteria. The first officers on the scene quickly realized they were dealing with more than just a simple robbery. The brutality of the scene, the clear signs of a struggle, pointed to something far more sinister. The investigation began in earnest, with detectives scouring the house for clues, piecing together the events that led to this tragic moment. 2 months after Emily's death, the case was handed over to Detective Haley Miles, a seasoned investigator known for her keen instincts and relentless pursuit of the truth. From the moment she stepped into the case, Detective Miles knew there was more to the story than a simple burglary gone wrong. The crime scene had been chaotic, but certain details didn't add up. The apparent randomness of the ransacking felt staged, too deliberate in its messiness. With years of experience, she recognized the subtle signs that often pointed to a deeper motive. Detective Miles began her investigation by revisiting the initial reports, carefully combing through the evidence collected at the scene. The focus initially remained on the theory of a botched burglary, but with each piece of evidence she reviewed, her suspicions grew. There were inconsistencies in the way the scene had been disturbed, and the manner of Emily's death suggested something far more personal than a mere robbery. Strangulation, as a method of murder, was intimate, fueled by strong emotions, anger, passion, desperation. It was clear to Miles that Emily's death was not just a random act of violence. As part of her thorough investigation, Detective Miles began questioning everyone who had been in contact with Emily in the days leading up to her death. Laura Morgan, as a close family friend and neighbor, was among those called in for questioning. Laura presented herself as the concerned and supportive neighbor, expressing shock and sadness over Emily's tragic death. She appeared cooperative, answering all of the detective's questions and even offering additional information when prompted. However, Detective Miles was trained to observe more than just words. During the interview, she noted subtle signs that made her uneasy. Laura's hands trembled slightly, and there were moments when she seemed to hesitate before answering. Her eyes would dart to the side when asked certain questions, and while her answers were mostly consistent, there were small inconsistencies that Miles couldn't ignore. These observations weren't enough to accuse Laura of anything outright, but they planted a seed of doubt in the detective's mind. Something wasn't right. Continuing her investigation, Detective Miles requested access to Emily's phone records, hoping they might shed light on her final days. When the records arrived, they revealed something unexpected: a significant number of calls and text messages between Emily and Laura in the months leading up to her death. The frequency and timing of these communications were unusual for a neighborly relationship. The messages, while not incriminating on their own, hinted at a closeness that seemed out of place. This discovery shifted the focus of the investigation. What had started as a search for a random burglar was now steering towards something much more personal. Detective Miles began to explore the possibility that Emily's relationship with Laura was more than what it seemed on the surface. The nature of their connection became a central point of the investigation, raising questions about Laura's involvement in Emily's life and potentially her death. The phone records provided a new perspective on Laura's potential motives, suggesting that their relationship had been intense, perhaps even troubled. This revelation added another layer of complexity to the case, bringing Laura further into the spotlight as a person of interest. As the investigation progressed, the forensic analysis of the evidence collected from the crime scene was completed. One finding stood out, a small but significant discovery. Fibers found on Emily's body matched the material from a piece of clothing belonging to Laura. While the evidence was circumstantial, it was a crucial piece in the puzzle. The fibers didn't prove guilt on their own, but they connected Laura to the scene in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed. Detective Miles knew this discovery could be the key to unraveling the truth, prompting her to intensify her focus on Laura. This new piece of evidence led to a more thorough investigation of Laura's alibi and her movements on the day of the murder. Miles began re-interviewing witnesses and gathering additional forensic evidence, hoping to find more connections between Laura and the crime. The case was building slowly, with each piece of evidence tightening the web around Laura. The fibers were just one link, but combined with the phone records and Laura's suspicious behavior, they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The investigation took another significant turn on May 25th, when a local teenager came forward with a startling piece of information. The witness claimed to have seen Laura leaving the Carter residence on the afternoon of Emily's death. This sighting placed Laura at the scene during the critical time frame, further implicating her in the crime. The teenager's testimony, while initially unconfirmed, aligned with the growing body of evidence that suggested Laura's involvement. Detective Miles approached the witness carefully, cross-referencing their statement with other evidence and ensuring its credibility. The witness's account was consistent, and there was no apparent motive for them to lie. With this new testimony, the case against Laura strengthened considerably. The combination of forensic evidence, phone records, and an eyewitness account provided a compelling narrative that suggested Laura had been present during Emily's final moments. The walls were closing in on Laura, and Detective Miles knew it was only a matter of time before she would have enough to make an arrest. With the mounting evidence against Laura Morgan, Detective Haley Miles sought and obtained a search warrant for the Morgan residence. The search was conducted meticulously, with the team scouring every corner of the house for anything that might connect Laura to Emily Carter's murder. During the search, a critical piece of evidence emerged: an item of jewelry belonging to Emily, tucked away in Laura's belongings. The discovery was damning. Emily's parents confirmed that the jewelry was a distinctive piece that Emily had worn frequently. The fact that it was found in Laura's possession raised immediate red flags, and the possibility of a mere coincidence was slim. This discovery was the final piece that Detective Miles needed. The jewelry linked Laura directly to Emily in a way that could not be easily explained. Laura was immediately arrested on suspicion of murder. The neighborhood buzzed with the shocking news, as the image of Laura as a devoted wife and mother shattered in an instant. As Laura was taken into custody, the full gravity of the situation began to sink in for everyone involved. This arrest was not just about a crime. It was about betrayal, hidden lives, and the destruction of trust. After weeks of investigation and gathering evidence, Laura Morgan was formally charged with first-degree murder. The charge was severe, reflecting the premeditated nature of the crime that the prosecution believed had occurred. Laura, however, maintained her innocence, insisting that she had nothing to do with Emily's death. She claimed that the jewelry had been found during a neighborhood walk and that she had simply forgotten to return it to the Carters. But this explanation did little to sway the authorities or the public. The weight of the evidence was heavily against her, and her story seemed implausible at best. The case attracted significant attention, both locally and beyond. The idea that a suburban housewife could be involved in such a brutal crime captivated and horrified people in equal measure. The courtroom was packed on the day Laura was charged, with reporters and onlookers eager to catch a glimpse of the woman who had gone from a model citizen to an accused murderer. The trial of Laura Morgan began with great anticipation. The prosecution, led by an experienced and determined team, presented a compelling case that painted a chilling picture of the events leading up to Emily's death. They highlighted the affair between Laura and Emily, focusing on Laura's obsessive and possessive behavior, which had escalated in the weeks before the murder. The prosecution laid out the timeline, showing how Laura's jealousy and fear of losing control over Emily had driven her to commit the unthinkable. Forensic evidence was a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The fibers found on Emily's body, the phone records, and the eyewitness testimony all pointed to Laura's guilt. The piece of jewelry discovered in Laura's possession was presented as the final nail in the coffin. The prosecution argued that Laura had kept it as a twisted memento of her relationship with Emily, further demonstrating her unhealthy obsession. As the trial unfolded, the defense struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. Laura's claims of innocence seemed increasingly hollow in the face of the detailed and damning case presented by the prosecution. The trial was tense, with each new piece of evidence adding to the weight of the prosecution's argument. The jury, made up of ordinary citizens, listened intently, their faces growing more somber as the case progressed. After weeks of testimony, evidence presentation, and emotional moments in the courtroom, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Laura Morgan was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was delivered with an air of finality as the weight of the decision settled over the courtroom. Laura's expression remained stoic as the sentence was read: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the gravity of her crime, ensuring that she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The verdict was a moment of closure for many, particularly for Emily's family, who had endured months of agony since her death. However, it also left a community grappling with the aftermath. The perfect facade that Laura had maintained for years was now permanently shattered. The neighborhood, once quiet and close-knit, was left in disarray as residents tried to process the fact that someone they thought they knew could be capable of such violence. In the days following the verdict, the neighborhood remained in a state of shock. The Morgans had been the epitome of suburban success, Laura, the perfect housewife, and Richard, the accomplished lawyer. Now that image was irrevocably tarnished. Richard Morgan, unable to cope with the enormity of what had happened, filed for divorce and moved away from the area. The strain of the trial, the public scrutiny, and the betrayal by the woman he thought he knew were too much for him to bear. His departure marked the end of the Morgan family as the neighborhood had known it. The local community was left to pick up the pieces. The case became a frequent topic of conversation, with people speculating about what might have driven Laura to such extremes. Some suggested that it was the pressure of maintaining her perfect life, while others believed it was simply a case of a person losing control. Regardless of the reasons, the case became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one's life is as perfect as it seems on the surface. As the case slipped from the headlines, one could only ponder the complexities Detective Haley Miles had unraveled. What began as a routine investigation into a robbery had exposed the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of suburban life. Could Laura Morgan's descent into madness have been avoided? Or was it inevitable once her obsessive love for Emily took hold? Some might speculate that had Laura chosen another path, perhaps Emily would still be alive. Was there a point where things could have turned out differently? Or was this tragedy always destined to happen? Laura's story reminds us that behind every closed door lies the potential for darkness, waiting to be uncovered. Now, as Laura serves her life sentence, we are left to wonder, what other secrets are still hidden in the quiet neighborhoods around us? So please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any of our true crime stories. We have many tales of ordinary lives spiraling into chaos, stories where obsession and secrecy become the ultimate downfall. Be sure to check them out.